Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Mark Kennedy. The Wilson Center was chartered by Congress as a memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the only president to earn a PhD, something I appreciate as President Emeritus of the University of Colorado. We are focused on international affairs, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. It has been my honor to be the founding director of the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. We're pleased to have with us one of our steering committee members, Tuan Nguyen, with us here today. The authoritarian regimes are seeking to tilt the global norms in their favor, and that has really spurred an era of strategic competition. I would argue that the central imperative of our day is to do all we can to ensure that that competition does not become conflict. A peaceful, stable world and economic progress both depend on sustained, coordinated deterrence of autocratic powers by the U.S. and its allies. President Trump put strategic competition center stage during his first term. We gather here today in the third day of Trump's second term to consider what will strategic competition look like in that second term. As a disclaimer, it's early days, a lot of news is coming fast and furious. We know that the future is always hard to predict, so we're telling you and giving you perspectives of what we know today. But he's really outlined in an ambitious agenda: strengthen America, settle the Ukraine conflict, recalibrate ties with Russia, push allies to do more, expand security alliances in the Middle East, all towards a goal of deterring China. We have assembled a stellar lineup of Wilson Center talent to explore this topic. We have with us here today Robert Daly, Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, Shihoko Goto, Director of the Indo-Pacific Program, Marissa Kurma, Director of the Middle East Program, and Jennifer Wistrand, Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. But to begin with and to help frame the conversation, we have Michigan Congressman John Moolenaar, Chairman of the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, to provide some remarks. So please roll the video.
Today, the Chinese Communist Party poses a military threat to America and our allies, an economic threat to our companies, and an ideological challenge around the world. The Chinese Communist Party believes it has learned from the mistakes of the Soviet Union, and it wants to compete on all three fronts. For years, leaders made the mistake of thinking the CCP wanted a competition. Our hopes for the Chinese people led American policymakers to believe that if we could make the People's Republic of China as rich as the West, then liberty would follow. However, the CCP understood that communism can never compete with freedom when it comes to human happiness or prosperity. They know that the only way they could win was for us to lose. The policies undertaken by the Chinese Communist Party, from poisoning our nation with fentanyl to crippling our economy through abusive trade practices and IP theft, are all aimed at destroying American society. The CCP approaches the United States as an enemy to be harmed rather than as a partner. For the past 2 years, the Select Committee has demonstrated how the CCP's aggression in areas like fentanyl, IP theft, transnational repression, Taiwan, and trade are all different fronts in the same war. There's nothing normal about the CCP's state-led mercantilist industrial policy that cripples American industry through illegal subsidies, IP theft, and the use of slave labor. There's also nothing normal, let alone most favored, about our trading relationship with China. It's time for U.S. law to reflect that through new tariff rates that target strategic sectors and boost supply chain resilience. Congress must work with the administration to reduce the flow of de minimis shipments into the United States a loophole that this year alone will allow more than 1 billion shipments to enter the United States, exempt from duties, taxes, and strict scrutiny. We must stem the flow of American capital and technology that is fueling the Chinese military modernization and human rights abuses. American dollars should not finance companies that are developing technology that could someday be used against American service members in a conflict, nor aiding the CCP's genocide of Uyghur Muslims. I know this is a priority of incoming Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. We must recognize, as my friend and former colleague Mike Waltz does, that there is no such thing as a private company in China. The CCP's 2017 national security law requires every Chinese company to obey the party and advance what the CCP terms national security. If Chinese companies aren't trying to advance the CCP's interests, they are violating Chinese law. There's no better example than ByteDance. It's the parent company of TikTok, which is so closely tied to the CCP that the Chinese government directly appoints a member of the board. Last spring, bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate passed our Select Committee's bill that requires TikTok to divest from parent company ByteDance. Our legislation provides President Trump with the leverage he needs to make the deal of the century, a deal that would keep TikTok available to the American users, but outside the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Our goal when it comes to TikTok is the same as our goal with trade, defense, education, and every other aspect of our rivalry with the CCP. To safeguard freedom against those who see their only hope for survival in its destruction. The CCP knows the same thing we do, that freedom will triumph in an open competition. I'm proud to carry forward the Select Committee's bipartisan mission, and I look forward to working with the Trump administration to win the competition against the CCP.
Well, thank you, Congressman Moolenaar, for those opening remarks. They give us a lot to talk about, so we'll dive right in with our panel here. And Robert, we're going to start with you first. You heard Congressman Moolenaar mention tariffs. You've heard Trump mention tariffs. He
has a familiar ring.
He didn't do anything on the first day, but he started talking about it on the second day. So when you think about it, the American business community would just as soon find some kind of negotiated settlement. The fact that Beijing sent their vice president for the first time is saying, communicating to us that they'd just as soon have a deal. So the real central question for us is, are we on the verge of another trade war or on the verge of a trade deal? And what does Trump's stated desire to be in China within the first 100 days, how does that fit into this?
Mark, I think you framed the question in exactly the right way. Broadly, I think it's going to be phased. It's going to go deal or an attempt at deal, and then a return to trade war after some kind of interregnum. China does see a path to a possible deal right now. They have been preparing for the second Trump administration. They've been doing this by sanctions-proofing their economy to the degree that they can. They can't do it entirely. By developing new markets, especially in the global south, and by developing further their leadership in certain key industries, especially in green technology. They tend to make the worst assumptions, but they're encouraged by the past few days. Trump has said that he's interested in going to China in the first 100 days, and China is a great believer in symmetry between leaders as enabling and directing bureaucracies. They're hoping that if he goes, and the trip they would see is inherently friendly, that some kind of deal, and I'm skeptical of this term, which is overused, can be put in place such that China revisits its phase one trade deal commitments, which it knows that it hasn't met, and then makes additional commitments. We're talking here about purchases and promises, in exchange for Trump holding off on the more extreme versions of the tariffs that he has threatened. And China would then like to proceed with more stability on those grounds. That is imaginable if, and this is where it gets really tricky, if the Trump administration doesn't really think this is a strategic competition. That's the question. Does the Trump administration really think that this is an urgent, epical competition in the way that the congressman just outlined, that comprises military, economic, ideological, and technological grounds? If the president himself truly shares that conviction, which is also a conviction to attempt to try to lead global order, then no trade deal is going to solve this from China's point of view. Okay? There's nothing, we are at the position we're in with China, some version of the tradition of the position that was just described, for structural and historical, very deep reasons that no one deal can undo. Again, unless the Trump administration really just sees this as an evening out of the trade balance. China is hoping that he does see it that way, that he really wants to focus on domestic issues, his reform of federal government, immigration, and his hemispheric agenda. The hemispheric agenda that comprises Greenland, Panama, and Canada gives China great hope that it can pursue its hemispheric agenda. So it would see a deal on the economic front as also comprising the geostrategic deal to move toward spheres of influence. We don't know what the president really thinks about this, so I think that China will make a preemptive move toward a deal that the president may accept. I suspect that even if we get that, we will then see that China continues to make gains in influencing global order, particularly in the global south, and dominating certain industries or winning those, such that the Trump administration would then swing back toward the proclivities of its more hawkish members. So a possible run at a deal, but a deal that really can't solve the historic impasse that we're in. Expect, I think, starts and stops.
So we'll still have South China Sea and everything else to have to worry about, even if they do achieve a deal.
None of this can be wished away.
It cannot be. But China is not the only place where we have challenges. If we go to Ukraine, the president has given his new envoy, I think another 100 days to get this figured out. But when you look at it, I can't see where the Venn diagrams come together, because Putin wants all of Ukraine, really, as well as to destabilize NATO. Ukraine wants all of their territory and to be in NATO, and Trump is not anxious to welcome Ukraine into NATO today. So to get a deal, you're going to have a tremendous amount of leverage on both Russia and Ukraine. What types of steps do you see, Jennifer, the president needing to take in order to create the kind of leverage that is going to be necessary to achieve some kind of a deal within Ukraine?
No, thank you, Mark. It's an excellent question. And just to underscore your opening remarks, and as Robert was saying too, we're only 3 days in, and I think it's so difficult to know what's going to happen. And with that, I would step back and say, with respect to where candidate Trump was, and then President-elect Trump, and now President Trump, there's been some change in the perspective he's taking. So when he was on the campaign trail, he was talking about he would bring an end to Russia's war of aggression in 24 hours. And then suddenly, when he was President-elect Trump, his advisors were walking him back a little bit and saying we probably would need 100 days to see some kind of meaningful change. And then I think a lot of people thought it was interesting that there was no mention of Russia or Ukraine in the inaugural speech. Obviously, as Robert was talking about, kind of these other more immediate hemispheric issues, but no mention of the Russia-Ukraine situation. However, within that first day, he made rather disparaging remarks about President Putin, saying that, I believe it was, President Putin is, quote, destroying Russia with his war in Ukraine. So we don't see a wholly consistent perspective with which to resolve the situation. In terms of what steps would be needed to be taken to broker a deal, it's clear at this point, or has been clear for a while, that Trump really has developed a pretty good relationship with President Zelensky of Ukraine. He seems to be confident that Trump could do something to resolve the situation. And similarly, historically, President Trump has had a decent relationship with President Putin as well. Now, it's possible that's going to change based on the rather disparaging remarks he made in the last 48 hours, but the relationship with the two people he would have to negotiate with seems pretty good. So I don't think he's going to have to really curry favor there. But getting to your point, as you underscored in your remarks, what steps are going to have to be taken? Right now, the two sides are wholly incompatible. Right? President Zelensky in Ukraine want an immediate and complete withdrawal of Russian troops from their territory, and they want to be able to see that they're going to pretty quickly be incorporated into NATO. President Putin and Russia, by contrast, want to be able to maintain upwards of the 18% of the territory they occupy, and they want guarantees that Ukraine is not going to become a member of NATO. So those are completely incompatible positions. I think that where President Trump would need to exert the greater amount of leverage is with respect to President Putin. Again, I think President Zelensky is going to be fairly amenable, but President Putin at present thinks that Russia is in a stronger position than Ukraine is. And if you actually step back and look at it, for all intents and purposes, for the past 2 years, the two countries have pretty much been in a stalemate. You've been basically at 18% of territory that Russia has acquired. Maybe a little bit more, sometimes maybe a little bit less, but there hasn't been a significant change. And therefore, Russia's not really in a stronger position, certainly if you look at casualties and other metrics. And if you add in then the economy, again, I think people thought Western sanctions would cause Russia's economy to crumble more quickly than it has. The sanctions have been effective, maybe not as effective as quickly as people thought. And so that's where I would start with the first area that I think President Trump could exert some leverage is with respect to the economy. I'm not an economist by training, so I would turn to them, but you can by all accounts see the economy is contracting for the third year in a row. You have high interest rates, you have high inflation, the ruble is weakening. So people don't know what the timeline is, but it is a matter of time before the Russian economy experiences more difficulties than it's having. So I think that's where Trump could possibly exert some pressure, is with respect to the economy. And the other is the area that came up again in the inaugural address when President Trump announced his national energy emergency and the comments that the United States is going to start increasing its drilling. We saw a decade ago how increased fracking in the United States enabled the United States to very move ahead in the gas markets and disrupt the gas markets in a way that wasn't anticipated. If we do go ahead with the drilling, it's possible we could disrupt the oil markets as well, and that is another area where Russia would be nervous because thus far they've been able to maintain a foothold because of China and India and some other areas, but that could be a point of leverage.
Very good. Thank you for that summary. And I think energy, it was interesting to hear the in the hearing for the Secretary of Treasury saying we even had more we could go with tariffs on energy. They could be more aggressive with China. They could be more aggressive with India, who is purchasing that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But also, not the only areas, Russia and China, we also have the Middle East, where Trump and Biden before him really would like a deal with Saudi Arabia. Both of them, got things they want, and there's a deal there, but the real sticking block is the idea that Saudi Arabia says they want a two-state solution with Palestine, or a path to that, whereas that's not really something Israel's eager to do. Is there a path to a deal in Saudi Arabia?
I think there's certainly a path to a deal with Saudi Arabia. This is something that they want. It represents a fresh page in their relationship with the United States. They are very keen on a defense agreement or a security agreement with the United States. But of course, October 7th shifted the calculus, and then more than 15 months of war in Gaza with very high Palestinian innocent civilians killed, and the destruction that we've seen have made things very difficult. So they certainly had a Palestinian component as part of the negotiations that took place before October 7th. But after that, the Saudis became very intent on ensuring that it's not just about some sort of political horizon when it comes to Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, but rather Palestinian statehood. I think that, President Trump was very clear in his inaugural address. He wants to be seen as a peacemaker in the region. He highlighted that message multiple times during his campaign as well, including to Arab American and Muslim American communities here in the United States. So I think many people, including the Saudis, are going to be very pragmatic in their approach, and they're going to negotiate. And so they may not necessarily be fixated on the establishment of a Palestinian state, because the pathway to that is unfortunately one ridden with many roadblocks given the situation in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. The Israelis have launched new military operations there just this past week, for example. But if they make concessions, they have to make sure that they're in line with what Arab public opinion also will accept, particularly in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they haven't had any protests because they don't allow protests to take place. But I, as a native Arabic speaker, I see social media, and I've spoken with people, young people from Saudi Arabia, and the pro-Palestinian sentiments are very, very high. So that's a part of the calculus that they are aware of. But I'm sure that they will move forward towards a deal.
Because they do have, Saudi Arabia wants American chips, they want help with nuclear energy, and they want to have F-35s. We, of course, want them to join the Abraham Accords and have a relationship with Israel. There's a lot on the table. It'll be another interesting theater to watch moving forward. But again, those three are important regions, but Indo-Pacific is also very central in our thinking here in the strategic competition. And Quad has been central to that. Now, it's expected that Trump, who doesn't really like multilateral, relations, is really going to focus that more militarily, whereas India has always wanted to see that as more than just a military alliance. Trump will be pushing the allies within Quad, India, Japan, Australia, to spend more on defense, to, in the case of Japan, make sure they're covering the bases of the U.S. there, to press them on trade, press them on a number of areas, on security cooperation, on tech. How will all that tensions, how will that strengthen the Quad? Will that fracture it? What do you think Trump's objectives are for the Quad?
Yeah, so Mark, I'm really glad that you're starting this conversation about the Indo-Pacific by focusing on the Quad because, as you know, Mark Rubio is the first member of the new Trump cabinet to be confirmed as Secretary of State. And yesterday, the State Department, under his leadership, released a statement about precisely this, the Quad. And it's a half-page statement. It talks about the importance of a free and open Indo-Pacific, the importance of abiding by the international law and the economic opportunities that are in the region. And they talk, the statement also mentions the need for to push back against unilateral actions that seek to change the status quo by force or coercion. So China is not mentioned, but it is clear that the Quad continues to look at China as a systemic threat to regional stability. And at the same time, it is looking, the United States continues to look at the Quad as a tool of organizing collective resilience and pushback against China. So we see a couple of trends here already. One is that we hope that there will be a continuum of U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific. As you said, Trump was the one who really put the Quad to the forefront. That was continued by Biden. We hope that this will continue, and certainly there is U.S. Commitment to have a summit meeting in India later this year. That said, we are also seeing a continuum of the United States moving away from a hub-and-spoke system and insisting on burden sharing. And this had started with Trump. It had continued with Biden. It will continue to accelerate under the new Trump administration as well. And from a regional perspective, the countries in the Indo-Pacific will want to continued U.S. commitment, and that will include enhancing this so-called lattice work of partnerships to enhance security and prosperity in the region. But at the same time, they are also being prepared to be less dependent on the United States. So we have systems such as the Quad. We have the development of AUKUS between Australia, Britain, and the United States for nuclear submarine capability enhancements. We've also seen the rise of Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, as well as the United States, in working closer together in the South China Sea. But we have to remember that the region is prepared for a new reality. And the new reality is what we've already discussed today, that the United States is being pulled in many directions. And although China will remain the systemic challenge for the United States, it's a strategic competition economically, from a security perspective, politically, that is very much coming from China. Nevertheless, the United States has many fires that it needs to tend to, including the conflict in the Middle East and the situation in Russia as well. I want to also point out that we've also seen a refocus on NATO and its focus areas. So NATO, of course, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is first and foremost concerned about the developments in Russia today. But at the same time, we've seen the IP4, namely Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, becoming permanent observer member states to NATO. And of course, these IP4 countries are contributing to the efforts in the Russia conflict. But at the same time, we can expect greater coordination and cooperation in especially information sharing when it comes to meeting that China challenge. And if I can just add one issue that I'm focused on in the region at the moment, and the expectation for the Trump administration to need to continue to focus on the Indo-Pacific is this, that we are seeing greater multipolarity in the Indo-Pacific. So we have, we've talked about China, we've talked about Russia, but we also have the North Korea ambitions. There are new forms of alliances or mechanisms for them to coordinate and cooperate or work together. And their end goal may or may not necessarily be clear, but at the same time, as we talk about the possibility of the United States being torn and being pulled in many directions, there is great concern in the region about, first and foremost, a new arms race, including the possibility of a nuclear arms race emerging in the region, which we need to bear in mind as well.
Well, thank you, Shihoko, and you're right. I mean, it'd be great if we could also have another seat here for Europe and what's going on there with NATO, for Latin America, for Africa. But you're also right on the arms race. I mean, these are scary times. I mean, we had mutually assured destruction when we had just one other nuclear stockpile. To have 3, 4, possibly Iran, which we could maybe talk about in a bit, adds a degree of complexity that we haven't dealt with in a long time. So it is, but when you see sort of the pattern, I think you'd hope that Trump is seeing the extent of the risk, which is why he says we need to have a stronger NATO. I need to actually get Saudi Arabia into a security alliance so that I have a stronger security alliance. I have to deal with some of the Middle East issues. We need a stronger Quad. So that pushing has, you know, perhaps some purpose behind it to build up for the risk that we're dealing. But I would say at the core of the competition with China is tech. And we had China who came out with their big, bold, Made in China 2025. Here we are in 2025. We have the U.S. that has, under Biden, have restrictions on imports, restrictions on exports, restrictions on outbound investments. We have a significant investment going on in chips in the Biden administration, and just announced yesterday in data centers here at the beginning of the Trump administration. Still, we're not funding the research. As university president, drives me nuts that we're driving enough research in the CHIPS and Science Act that was authorized. But how do you see this playing out? And you know, you mentioned that you didn't know which view Trump had. Was it just an economic view, or was it a broader view? Because would you really trade loosening tech restrictions for something, which is what China really wants,
Right.
For them buying more soybeans? I mean, how does that play out, and what steps should Trump take in this tech race that is at the center of this competition?
So as you note, the Biden administration was very explicit about tech being at the center of competition, and it put in place export controls the so-called small yards, high fence policy. But that approach really did begin in the first Trump administration. They weren't quite as explicit about it, but people in the Trump NSC were focused fairly early on the tech competition and on semiconductors in particular. The Biden administration built fairly strongly with mixed effectiveness on that. I think the Trump administration is going to have to continue to build on that foundation. Whether it does that because the Trump administration sees tech broadly and interwoven with questions of economic development and global order competition, does it see that in a truly strategic way, or does the president see it as winning in a series of separate industries vis-a-vis China is a key question. But either way, he's going to have to continue the investments that you've already mentioned and the policies which are frankly aimed at kneecapping China's development of advanced computing or advanced semiconducting and other areas. So will that happen in a systemic way? I think the answer is probably broadly yes. On the investment side, there's another question which you touched on, which is the talent side. The role of universities here is absolutely key. And it's not just that universities are producing knowledge through their research. We have the world's leading universities because they're highly open and highly internationalized. There has been a wing that is in part represented in the Trump administration, which tends to see universities in an adversarial framework. How is that going to be reconciled is a key question. And we see positive as well as negative signs. As you know, Elon Musk recently had a bit of a dust-up with Steve Bannon because Musk was advocating for increased use of H-5 visas that allow talented workers to come here. Remember in June, during the campaign, twice, then candidate Trump said that every foreign student in the United States who was then vetted should essentially get an American green card, a path to citizenship. And he stated that very broadly. It wasn't just STEM. It even comprised associate's degrees. He said this twice in June. It hasn't been repeated since, but that indicates that somebody in his circle sees the importance of talent. And I think that that's a very important tell. Is there some attempt to really follow through on that, to make America at the university level initially, but then with paths to citizenship, become a magnet for global talent? I think that will be a key tell about how serious they are about the comprehensive tech competition. But that approach is going to have to involve some modification of a somewhat antagonistic views of universities as institutions. But that's going to be one of the things that I'll be watching.
And you've seen the tension within the Republican Party, as you already mentioned, between the more traditional MAGA group as well as the Elon Musk tech group. But it warms my heart to hear you talk about the importance of talent, because I do believe we're all in a talent race, and we need these universities are our asset in that regard. And I know there's tensions there, but we need to recognize that for us to have the research to discovery, the collaborating with young venture firms, we're going to need both that research in universities as well as the talent that they provide and the international talent that they also train, and most of which stay here and help us in our tech race.
And universities can only play this function in the STEM fields if they are equally free to play it in the humanities and the social sciences. The idea that we can only be great in STEM fields while denigrating other disciplines, this is the Chinese view. This is why their universities are
limited.
Are very, very limited. So it really needs to be a value on universities and their openness and internationalization across the disciplines, or even the more specific STEM fields will wither.
And if you really want to get into innovation, it's really those that have both an artistic side as well as a science side that are really creating the most innovation. So you're spot on. Marissa, you're wanting to say something.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to include the global competition part of China and tech, because that's certainly one area that is contentious between many key U.S. allies in the Middle East and the United States. It's how open they've become to China economically, but particularly when it comes to tech. I mean, they don't have any issues dealing with Chinese tech companies. They're the United Arab Emirates, for example, hosts China TV in Arabic, and we were just earlier talking about the Saudis. There are over 750 Chinese companies operating in Saudi Arabia and leading key projects. It's not just small companies. I mean, this is a serious economic engagement, and of course, China is Saudi Arabia's number one trading partner when it comes to imports, as they import their oil. So this is one aspect that is adds even more complexity to the various relationships that the Trump administration has to reckon with. And going back to the deal with Saudi Arabia, that's probably going to be part of that discussion. But the GCC in particular had started looking towards China because they will pursue their national interests, and that was also at a time when the United States was less engaged in the Middle East. So I think all of these points are key points to consider as the Trump administration rolls out its foreign policy, not just in the region, but globally. Everything is interconnected.
You're absolutely right. It's central. I mean, one of the biggest questions we have as we're moving towards the world of AI is that Saudi Arabia has committed to invest $100 billion in AI. Are they going to invest that in Chinese AI or American AI?
They prefer American AI, but they need to be engaged as part of that discussion, right?
And so that is a path. We have some issues we need to get through and balance to get there, but that is a path. Right now, the Middle East is, let's be wishful thinking, and 55, 60% U.S., 40% China. If we want to get them further, tech cooperation is the way, and that's a difficult conversation. I'll have some criticisms coming out on the recent rules for AI diffusion that I think go against our ability to really embrace people. Putting Saudi Arabia in tier 2 and all those issues is a longer conversation for another day. But let's get back to Russia. When we think about Russia, at his heart, Donald Trump believes that having some kind of relationship with Russia, trying to pry them away from China, is a good thing and is necessary for us in this strategic competition. He's got a lot of criticism for that over the years, but he's stuck to that to try to drive some daylight in between this relationship. How possible is that? What steps could he take? Is this realistic?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very difficult question. I don't need to ask the China expert to weigh in as well. Russia and China obviously have a very long history. They've got the shared border. I think it's now the 5th or 6th longest shared border in the world. And so because of that short border, they're going to constantly have to deal with one another, and they have had to constantly deal with one another. In anticipation of this conversation, I was rereading yesterday an article that Graham Allison, professor at Harvard, but also former Assistant Secretary of Defense, had written 2 years ago that was published in Foreign Policy, and it's an excellent summary, very, very succinct summary of his perspective on the relationship between Russia and China. And the 4 points he underscores, the personal, economic, military, and diplomatic intricacies between that relationship. And, he mentions things on the personal front, and I was even shocked by this number, that President Putin and President Xi have met over 40 times in recent time. On the economic, China is very much supporting Russia through the Western sanctions, being its leading trading partner. Militarily, they've had increased military engagement 2017 onward. Diplomatically, and we've talked about kind of regional alliances blossoming. Russia and China are members of a lot of multilateral organizations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, which met in Russia this past year. They also tend to support one another in UN votes. So this is a very tight relationship, and I think where it would be tricky for President Trump to go in and kind of create, so you're talking about, a wedge or something between the two countries, is this relationship is so entwined, and it's not in the past 10 years or 10,000 years. It's a long-standing relationship. Just underscoring that as well, if you go back to February 2022, Russia and China declared a, quote, no-limits partnership with respect to economic, political, and military cooperation. And then if you jump ahead to the past 3 days, Russia and China, Xi and Putin had a phone call within, I believe, hours of President Trump's inauguration, an hour and 30-minute phone call, undoubtedly underscoring a lot of things, but one of the things they underscored was their shared respect and trust in one another, and again, this idea of creating a multipolar world. So I think, all of that to say, I think it is very difficult to think of where there could be light, as you were talking about, to create a wedge between the two countries. I think one area where you could create potentially a nominal wedge between the two is not trying to look at it transactionally, what can the U.S. go in to disrupt either Russia or China, but where is there some level of competition between the two that they could, and that would be in their proximate neighbors of Central Asia and the South Caucasus. So historically, and by historically here I'm talking about like the last 100 years, Russia has continued to maintain a quote, special relationship with the former Soviet South Caucasus and Central Asia, and that's because of the time they spent as a part of the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1991. So in the wake of 1991, Russia has still had a lot of regional alliances with countries in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. There's been economic cooperation, and you saw that again very blatantly in the past couple years, where despite the fact China and India have very much supported Russia with sanctions evasion, the South Caucasus and Central Asian countries have also been important partners for helping Russia withstand Western sanctions. Russia has very much viewed that region, South Caucasus and Central Asia, those countries, those 8 countries, as its sphere of influence, but China disrupted that a bit in the last 10 to 12 years with its Belt and Road Initiative that went through. So not only did it disrupt it by going through Central Asia, it announced the launch of it in Kazakhstan, one of the former Soviet countries. With Russia has a long border and has a large ethnic Russian population there. And so then over the past 12 to 14 years, China has not only gone into Central Asia and the South Caucasus economically, it's also started to go in there militarily, if you look at Tajikistan and other areas. So I think to the extent that the United States is able to take a look at this and see what changes are going on right now and what changes could go on that would give one country or the other a comparative advantage. And there I would say to look at the South Caucasus, where you've got potentially the normalization of relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia because of their longstanding conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. If that normalization does indeed continue, then China, which has a very strong economic relationship with the EU, would potentially be able to have not only a land, but a very significant transport corridor going from China through Central Asia, through the South Caucasus, directly into the EU, which would enable it to bypass Russia and Belarus, not only pragmatically, but also metaphorically as well. So that's where I would say, again, I think it's pretty difficult to see how you could meaningfully disentangle Russia and China on those big scales, but looking at kind of a regional strategic cooperation could be one area.
Some good insights, and that would, if they got that path, that would make Russia even more so the junior partner, which I don't know if that opens up avenues as well. Let's turn back to Iran, Marissa. When you think about what's happened there, you've got their allies diminished within Gaza and Lebanon. You have Syria, which is now not necessarily within their control. You have their barrages against Israel proved to be largely ineffective. They're feeling a little vulnerable right now. Trump's got 3 ways he could go. He could be supportive of Israel taking an attack on their nuclear sites. He could also go back to maximum pressure, or he could look for a deal in their vulnerable state of getting them to get off the nuclear path and not disrupt their neighbors and not sell drones to Russia. How do you think Trump is looking at this or should look at this?
Well, I think that it could be a mix of maximum pressure and diplomatic pressure. So the maximum pressure, of course, was both a diplomatic isolation and economic pressure through sanctions, which was what he pursued in his first administration. But there are a few steps that he took just yesterday that are already showcasing perhaps a slight shift away from political pressure or diplomatic isolation completely, with his choice of Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon, who's known to be more of the view that Iran can be contained, and has made multiple statements in the past and has criticized, in fact, the Biden administration for not putting enough pressure on Israel, for example, when it comes to allowing humanitarian aid in Gaza. So he's making some people nervous about those who prefer a more aggressive approach with Iran. But as you stated, Mark, the so-called axis of resistance that Iran has invested in for 4 decades is not as strong as it used to be. It has been severely weakened. They are not in Syria anymore. And so they have also been making various diplomatic statements about peace in the region and stability in the region. And so there may be an opportunity there where perhaps a combination of maximum pressure economically and some diplomatic pressure could lead somewhere. But too much pressure could also be problematic, because then they will be cornered into perhaps even lead Ayatollah Khamenei to formally authorize the creation of a nuclear weapon, and that becomes very problematic, right? I mean, we've heard a lot of the IAEA reports, and we know that they're closer than ever before. But I think there's, again, I mean, we've heard Secretary Rubio talk about maximum pressure during his hearing, but what combination of diplomatic tools will they use remains to be seen. But it seems that there may be an opening for engagement.
Well, we have enough challenges on our plate that if there was any path, that would be great. But as you say, a lot of danger there. I'm going to turn to you, Shihoko, and you just released the hitting the reset button in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of good stuff here. I'd recommend it to those watching. One of those was to shift the regional economic dynamics. And I was going back in the first Trump administration. He actually did a deal with Japan on agriculture and digital. They were close to doing a deal with India in 2020 before COVID hit. They also, in 2018, had Trump and the head of the European Commission issued a joint statement saying they were trying to have a zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers deal. So if he in 2018 considered the EU a quote-unquote bilateral, would he consider ASEAN a bilateral? What hopes do you have, what advice would you give as to what steps the U.S. could take to answer the yearning that you see in that region for more economic engagement by the United States?
Right. So before I go into the potential of new trade partnerships in the region, I actually want to go back to some of the points that you were making earlier about workforce development and competition for talent. And I say this because as we talk about strategic competition with China, we should also focus on some of China's weaknesses. And yes, we know that there are some fundamental weaknesses to the Chinese economic base, not least the fact that it has an aging demographic, it has an energy security challenges, it has the real estate bubble, the financial sector is under a great deal of pressure. But another thing that I do want to point out is the weakness in dealing with the innovation economy, that it is not necessarily accepting of creative destruction, which is so part of the driving force of innovation and technology, advanced technology in particular. And we talk about the strength of state-owned enterprises and that China has undue ability to manage and control industrial policy. That can actually backfire too by investing too heavily in industries that are, quite frankly, dead weight. And we should bear that in mind as we look at what the United States is trying to do under the new administration. And there is a race for capital, new capital. And the priority of this administration will be to boost domestic investments, both from within its own borders and also from overseas as well. And the advanced technology economies, especially of Northeast Asia, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, are seeing this as a potential opportunity to not only enhance their own partnerships with the United States, but also to enhance their own economic capabilities as well. And I would also say that there is greater opportunity and a greater role for the private sector to drive some of those investments and contribute to the strategic growth objective of the United States. And you said at the beginning that we've already seen the development, day two of the Trump administration. We've seen announcements of data centers, and that comes from a partnership between OpenAI as well as SoftBank in Japan to invest up to $500 billion in the United States on AI infrastructure. And we're already seeing the development of that in play in Texas. And so this is a great opportunity that highlights some of the partnerships that the United States can have, the private U.S. companies can have with the Japanese private company counterpart as well. And I should point out that under the first Trump administration, Japan was actually first out of the gate in reaching out to President-elect Trump. And so I think many of us have heard the story about then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe going to the Trump Hotel? No, Trump Tower in New York with bearing gifts, golden golf clubs and the like. And so there was a lot of pressure on Japan to also be first out of the gate in reaching out to the second term of President Trump. And what has happened is that the first prominent Japanese to meet with President-elect Trump this time around was not a Japanese government official in office, but it was actually, one, the widow of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and then secondly, the CEO of SoftBank, Masayoshi Son. And at Mar-a-Lago, he made this commitment to invest more in the United States in AI. And here we are, first week of the new administration, and we're seeing that commitment actually gaining traction as well. So that's the good side. Those are the positive potentials that we should be looking forward to. But when it comes to trade agreements, we should bear in mind but not only was President Trump under his first administration, one of the first things he did was to pull the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. But again, there is a continuum. President Biden had the opportunity for the United States to join this now CPTPP, but that opportunity was not taken. Biden had pushed forward a new concept called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, but that never really, that has had its own challenges as well. Of course, the goal of the United States is not necessarily to have trade agreements for the sake of trade agreements, even though there is political value in enhancing economic relations through trade agreements and enhancing economic partnerships through those trade agreements as well. But given that the United States' ultimate goal right now is to decrease dependence not just on Chinese imports, but imports more broadly from overseas, and to enhance its own domestic capabilities in meeting not just its critical needs in advanced technology, but also across the board. And this is where the tariff regime will come in. The impetus for many foreign governments and indeed private companies across the Indo-Pacific will be to invest more in the United States. And then the question becomes, how can this be a win-win for both sides, or will it be a winner-take-all type of system that will develop?
Well, I was interested to read that the foreign direct investment numbers came out yesterday, and the amount invested in the U.S. was a record percentage of what the globe invests abroad. But I hope that we can understand that to get that supply chain less dependent on China, we're going to need Southeast Asia. So hopefully that resonance is understood.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, of course, it's still very early days, but there's been a lot of focus on the technology, the advanced technology sector. But of course, the goal is to enhance manufacturing as well. And it's to create manufacturing resilience in the United States, but also to create manufacturing opportunities for manufacturers overseas as well. And as countries pursue a China plus one strategy, and we see that from Japan, we see that from Korea, we see that from Taiwan, all these other countries, as they try to de-risk from China, they're investing more in other countries, especially across Southeast Asia. There is an opportunity for the United States to invest more and for the role of the U.S. government to provide this guarantees that the U.S. companies will need to continue to invest in the global south.
You mentioned manufacturing. You mentioned that we need to have more manufacturing here in America. America is still the largest economy, but China has $1 trillion more manufacturing than America, 75% bigger than America. And now, maybe it's too much, as you say, driven by these state-driven overcapacity. Their profits within China are going down. And that's a big part of the friction here that you heard Congressman Moolenaar, you heard the president talking about, is that wave of cheap goods spreading across the world. The interesting thing to consider is that we complain about our trade deficit, but our trade deficit with China is only 1/3 of their surplus. So the pain we're feeling is being felt around the world. How does Trump deal with this? How does he get China, Robert, to have a more balanced, domestic consumption economy? What we've done so far hasn't quite worked. What can he do to prod them in a more useful direction?
Well, I think we learned from the first trade war and the first trade deal, and we've continued to learn subsequently throughout the Biden administration, that really the United States can do very little to get China to address what we call the structural issues in their economy. This was what the first trade deal aimed at, is to try to get China to cut back its various forms of support, direct and indirect, for Chinese state-owned enterprises. And in the trade one deal didn't address this at all. We threw in the towel on this. And the reason that we threw in the towel is that China cannot give satisfaction on its state support of industries without completely changing and undermining its form of government. It's absolutely central to the leadership and the economic and technological and social plans of the Chinese Communist Party. So there isn't any lever, including tariffs, that are going to get China to cut back on its support for its public as well as its private industries. That doesn't exist. Again, central. So they're not going to give satisfaction. They have been working very hard to, sanctions-proof their economy to the degree that they can. They've been watching what happened to Russia, limited what they can do there, and they've been growing their export markets, especially in the global south, which, Shihoka, you just mentioned, but we haven't spoken about nearly enough. One of the problems with this strategic competition framework, or focusing on great powers, is we commit our perennial sin of ignoring Africa, ignoring Latin America, all markets where China is extremely active, and it can now provide to these places the world's best electronic vehicles at a fairly low price, and help them solve other problems. And so, we say overcapacity, and that's true. We're not the only ones who are concerned about this. It's a major problem, but we often stop with the accusation and don't look at what China is in fact doing. And so I think that there's very little we can do to get China to change what is in fact the Chinese Communist Party's approach to governance, which includes seeing the economy not as a separate part of China to be run by market principles, but as making an essential contribution to China's national welfare, and therefore being a central concern of the government. So I think we're going to have to face up to the fact that the Trump administration, like the Biden administration, this is not a partisan issue, cannot get China to change that piece. It's bedrock for them.
So they're committed to having a CCP, Chinese Communist Party-centric economy.
You bet. But they wouldn't put it that way. They would say it would be an economy directed and managed by the Communist Party for the good of the Chinese people. I mean, here we've got to be, I think, especially now that we are involved, as we've discussed here on this stage, as I've written, I think in what is a new kind of Cold War. I think we have to get the framing right. and we're still struggling with that. Congressman Moolenaar now just said, China sees the United States as an enemy to be harmed. I don't think that's quite right. I think China sees the United States as an obstacle to be overcome or worked around. Not quite the same thing. If they could reach all of their goals while ignoring us entirely, they would prefer to do that. Now, they can't do that, and because in their pursuit of their goals, they do pose real challenges and real threats to us that have to be met, and there are certain contests that I think we need to be committed to winning. But this notion that the goal is to harm the United States in the first instance, or the goal is to have industrial overcapacity for its own sake, that's not quite it. They believe absolutely in Chinese Communist Party's absolute and oppressive control, but in the interest of China's long-term developments. And I think we need to frame and understand it in that way, as complicated as it is, and we must absolutely be vigilant to our own threats. But to simply put out overcapacity and not try to understand the reasons they're there, if we don't do that, we can't have a policy that effectively counters what is in fact a real danger of overcapacity.
And you bring up an important point. It's hard to get China to change, for us to do that, but we should change because we're not focusing enough on Africa, on Latin America, on Southeast Asia.
And they're making real gains.
And again, I've been spending a lot of time in this recent AI dispersion, which mix security with protectionist. And the protectionism that's embedded in that actually undermines the security and will make it harder for our tech companies to go out to Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia and help them. So we need to change that mentality in what we do, getting back to what Shihoko talked about with the trade. But let's go back to Ukraine. And when you hear the people that are reluctant to have Ukraine be part of NATO, they say they haven't done enough on reforms. Now, they've made a lot of progress on their economy and the political, military side, but still view corruption as an area where they made progress but have more to make, and the interoperability. What's your thoughts on Ukraine's path towards what they've done, what they need to do to coincide with the NATO standards?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a very fair question. I think Ukrainians would say it's a very fair question. So you mentioned, interoperability of Ukraine's security measures, are there with NATO, and that's certainly an issue. I think, again, Ukrainians are aware of that, and if you look at the number of things that have to be achieved, well, it's not easy. I think that's an easier path to go down in terms of almost kind of what needs to be done to achieve that than the other topic you mentioned, which is corruption, which is a very tricky issue. And again, Ukrainians are patently aware of it, and it's a very sensitive issue because of that. This is actually a good segue with what Robert was talking about in terms of structural issues, and I think you can make a comparison with respect to how Ukraine is having to confront corruption. All the former Soviet countries, to one degree or another, and even the former socialist countries, so the satellite countries, if we look at on that flank of the former Soviet Union, have had endemic corruption problems going back to the Soviet and post-Soviet period, and it's been very difficult for them to rid themselves of that past. That's not that they're not trying to, but again, they're patently aware of it, and it's a very sensitive issue. If you look at Transparency International, which tracks corruption around the world, it came into being in the immediate aftermath of the collapses of the Cold War. At present, within the last year or two, Ukraine ranks 104 out of 180 countries. So, and by comparison, Russia ranks 141. And again, if you were to look at a lot of the former Soviet and former socialist countries, they have pretty low rankings. So Ukraine's corruption ranking is not great. However, it has increased in recent years, and that's because of a lot of these reforms it's taking, specifically with this goal of being able to become a part of the EU and become a part of NATO. You can argue that the anti-corruption reforms that Ukraine has pursued in the post-2014 period, so basically 2015 to 2021, have made a real change if you look at the national level. And this is where it's important to, on this, look at national, regional, and local. So on the national level, you can say that there have been significant changes if you look at tax administration and other areas. And those are things that, again, the EU or NATO are going to look at. Are you making these macro structural changes? So there have been changes, and that's probably influencing the increase in the ranking that Transparency International is giving. Unfortunately, if you then look at the regional and local level, that's where, again, you start to see more of this, getting back to kind of structural issues, this endemic corruption that goes back to the way the Soviet socialist command economies operated. And if you look at, polling that's done by local organizations, Ukrainians will report still, they themselves are aware of, kind of everyday corruption happening in things like medical institutions, hospitals, or schools or things like that. So we're talking at a very local level, and that's very difficult to just overnight disentangle from a system. So again, national, regional, local is difficult to look at, but you need to look at them on those three levels. Then you also have to look at where has corruption been, kind of again in these longstanding institutions. With them, people talk about new corruption. So the war has unfortunately brought its own share of corruption into the country. So while you could say maybe there's been 2 steps forward in this 2015 to 2021 period, then there's maybe been 1 step back with respect to the war. And again, there you can look at whether it comes to recruitment, placement of new recruits, even some people talking about the government being involved. So again, the war has brought its share of corruption. Again, now if you look and say once, if a peace deal is brokered, if there's some meaningful path towards peace for both Ukraine and its relations with Russia, then presumably corruption on that level would recede. But again, if you read reports, people are afraid that then the next wave of corruption might come through reconstruction. That's another well-documented area where you can see corruption. So I think it's a difficult thing to look at. I would say, again, if you stand back and look in the long, Ukraine has made significant gains, certainly at the national level. It needs to make more at the regional and local. And probably where it's going to need help is in, rule of law, getting a judiciary that's strong and independent. And then, as it's been very effective, getting the oligarchic or patronal relations more removed from the structure.
But you are right that when you have massive amount of reconstruction, which you would hope would happen after if we reach a deal, that's ripe for corruption. So having a keen focus on that throughout that period will be an important thing to do. Thank you, Jennifer. Marissa, the Houthis, in case we didn't have enough issues to worry about. They've recently said that we can go through with our ships now that we've done a deal in Gaza so long as we keep behaving ourselves. But the idea that the Russian and the Chinese ships have been able to go through the Red Sea with the Westerns not, and that we have to get a permission slip from the Houthis is clearly not what we're looking for.
The way forward?
And the Saudi Arabias have tried war, they've tried UN mediation, they've tried direct negotiation, it hasn't worked. And they've also turned the control over Bab el-Mandeb to a billion-dollar machine of extortion going through there. So it's hard for them to walk away from that proven moneymaker. How much should the Trump administration be prioritizing this amongst all the other challenges we've talked about today? And what path would they have there?
I mean, the Houthi attacks, and I think they've probably had more than 100 vessels with drones since October 7th, have, as you mentioned, in their words, in solidarity with the Palestinian people. But you and I were in a meeting with the Israeli economic counselor who told us that basically their disruption of trade in the Red Sea did not really impact the Israeli economy. That's a talking point worth highlighting to the Houthis, because that's essentially what they're trying to, primarily target Israel. So with the new Trump presidency, the UN-recognized government in Yemen sees a huge opportunity with President Trump. They've been very critical of the Biden administration for first removing the Houthis from the terrorist list, and they believe that the Houthis have to be dealt with forcefully. Now, does that mean that they have to be dealt with militarily? I mean, we've also seen a series of attacks both by Israel and the United States. However, it's not clear because, like you said, war is not going to resolve the conflict in Yemen. And even the UN-recognized government is not necessarily talking about unification at this point. The vice president of the UN recognized government just had an interview with Reuters this past week and said that at this point this is not a path. We're not looking for a path towards unification, but we do need President Trump to put tremendous pressure on Iran in order to deal with the Houthis. So this will probably be part of an Iran policy. This is, of course, an issue that key U.S. allies in the Gulf will also prioritize in their discussions with the administration, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so we have to wait and see.
So if we're going to hope to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, which I'm going to be doing just now, we need to try to get some kind of resolution here to keep the Middle East a bit more stable than it has been in the past. So big challenges ahead. Now, to the audience, this is my last question that I'm going to ask Shihoko, and then I'm going to turn to you for questions, so be prepared. Shihoko, going back to your excellent book, you talked about activating private investment. Remind ourselves that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation came to life in the first Trump administration. More recently, some of his associates have been talking about making it into a sovereign wealth fund, making it even bigger than it is. Their conversations talked about Greenland and Panama, but let's focus it on the Indo-Pacific. What more can the U.S. do if we're not going to necessarily be as aggressive in trade as they want, to bring investment in there and win-win relationships in their infrastructure throughout? What path do you see there?
Right. So the question also is to what end, right? So we look at this strategic competition between the United States and China, and there is one part of it, the competition for the global South. And you have rightly focused on the financial incentives or motivations. And certainly China has come up with a strong portfolio. We haven't really talked about the Belt and Road Initiative or the Digital Silk Road, but the counterbalance to that is not to compete dollar for dollar with BRI, but to provide high-quality infrastructure. And then another area would be to provide greater human capital development. And I would also say a critical part of this would be to support efforts for emerging markets to move up the value chain as we talk about supply chain resiliency. But we should bear in mind that as we see the continued rise of the BRICS, and yes, the BRICS, there has been an expansion. There's now 10 countries in addition to the original 5. One of the primary motivations is to have coordinated efforts to mobilize capital. Another motivation is to decrease dependence financially on the United States. One of that is for de-dollarization, right? And quite frankly, to have greater resilience to U.S. sanctions as well. But we should also bear in mind we can argue to what extent the BRICS is strong or whether it's toothless or not. But what I can say is that one of the biggest motivating factors to bring these disparate countries from Brazil to UAE to Ethiopia to a common forum is wariness about the United States and this deep underlying uncertainty about the United States. So there shouldn't be an effort to compete dollar for dollar, dollar for yuan against the BRI, but the United States really needs to leverage its biggest strength, which is the trust that it has built. We've talked about countries wanting an AI system that is U.S. systems-based rather than Chinese-based. There is a reason for that. How can we do that? We see in Africa, China has come to dominate the IT infrastructure. Is that acceptable? Can we actually move forward with that? These are areas where DFC certainly can encourage U.S. private companies to take on the risk and to invest more in emerging markets so that they too can move up the value chain as well.
And I've always viewed infrastructure as a channel through which future commerce flows. So if we want to deal with our trade deficit, invest more abroad, create more partners, get more trade. So great remarks. Now we'll turn it over. I got plenty of other questions to ask. And I don't know if we have a mic. A mic will come to you. Please state your name, your affiliation, and your question clearly.
Stanley Coburn, no affiliation. I'm puzzled by all this concern about the trade deficit. U.S. unemployment, according to the official statistics, is very low. The last unemployment figures were quite good. the dollar is strong. Actually, one of the puzzles I have is why, in light of the Chinese trade surplus, their currency is so weak. I wish I heard some discussion of that. Return on invested capital here is very strong. So what's the problem?
Does anybody, I'm happy to jump into that, but Robert or Shihoko, would you like to comment?
I would like to comment, but I suspect I'd rather comment after your thoughts on this.
I would say if you ask many economists, they would ask that same question. If somehow that's weakening us, Japan has had a trade surplus with America for a decade or two, and yet our economy has grown much bigger than Japan's over that decade or two. So I think the talk about it is that it's been central to Trump viewing that that's the problem here if we have a trade deficit. And there will be, I think we know in the second term, as there was in the first term, a continued focus on if you have a trade surplus with America, that's going to be a focus in all of our bilateral relations. And why can't you buy more from us, and how can we structure a deal? Now, the good news is I think there's a lot of opportunities. If you look at Europe, they need more natural gas, take less from Russia. That's an opportunity. You look at, they need to be spending more in defense. We've got something to sell them. It's not always easy in every country, but I think it will be a point of contention, even though a lot of economists are asking the same question you're saying. Robert or Shihoko, any comments?
Why don't you go first and then I'll...
Well, sort of broadening out from your general approach here, we were talking about strategic competition. We've said with China. We haven't really discussed what this competition is about. You know, why are we here? You know, we're competing for what exactly? And I think, you know, any answer to individual interests in, say, trade deficits would have to be framed, would ideally be framed within that context. My assumption for the past several years has been that the competition is ultimately about which set of values is going to be prominent in shaping global systems, global orders, global rules. And my assumption has been that we had an ongoing and profound interest in global systems being more or less liberal, more or less transparent. Is that still the case? The president doesn't really talk in those terms. He speaks in terms of trade deficits. So it's very difficult for me to analyze now where, as a country, how we're approaching these issues. I'm waiting to see how it develops and waiting to see how the president's own instincts, those of the more sort of MAGA group within his camp, those of the American primacists, the traditional American primacists who are very much in his camp now, Secretary of State Rubio, Michael Waltz, how is this all going to shake down? And so I've being very careful about pronouncing on these issues until we realize where we are. And I think that's going to be a long, complicated process of settling out.
And just very quickly, what is the competition about? From an economic front, it is about the United States maintaining its advantages that it has. We no longer talk about China catching up. China has caught up or has exceeded the United States in many key sectors, and especially when it comes to solar panels and EVs. When we talk about the trade deficit, one of the biggest structural concerns that we have is about the exporting of excess capacity. We've seen that in the possibility of China defining the rules of advanced technology. So when we talk about protecting the advantages that the United States has in advanced technologies, that should not be taken for granted. The advantages that the United States has in AI and semiconductor manufacturing are clear, but it is not necessarily going to be the case 5-10 years from now. And so this is the moment to take on measures if the United States is serious, but it must work together with its allies and partners. But that's the coordinated effort. One last thing. The real challenge, though, is the potential rise of different systems that may or may not be compatible with one another. And how do we deal with that, especially when we talk about private sector engagement and investments? It's going to be very costly, if nothing else, to be able to work in a siloed system that's beginning to emerge.
And we at the WABA Institute have a page where we have multiple people, including many on stage here, talking about what is strategic competition that I would refer to you. To me, China is, for all their faults, the most peer ally, rival competitor we've had. Bigger than relative economically, militarily, and diplomatically than we faced in World War II or before. Go back to the founding. So my focus on strategic competition is having Xi wake up every morning and decide not to start conflict in the Western Pacific. For that, we need to be strong and we need to have allies. And so I frame everything through that. So I hope that in this process, we're strong and we also have strong allies in the trade, however we focus on trade deficits. Next question. We'll go right here in the third row here. Again, name, affiliation, question.
Steve Jackson, former fellow here at the Wilson Center and currently on faculty at George Washington University. I'm teaching a course on China and the Global South. So, Robert, this is for you. I'm wondering whether the Trump administration's affection for tariffs in a fairly broad brush way will wind up severely hurting the United States and its efforts to develop further our relations with the Global South. President Trump in his first term made some remarks about Africa that were less than complimentary. And many of the countries, including Mexico, Vietnam, are developing trade relationships that have Chinese involvement, and whether that is going to be subject to additional tariffs, and thus the very countries that we're trying to reach out to are going to be harmed by this.
And implicit in that is the question of whether tariffs are an effective response to everything that we find annoying or inconvenient or not in line with our interests. China has long made tremendous gains in Africa and Latin America. It has experience going back to the Bandung Conference in the 1950s of working with what was then called the Third World, the developing world. Very high degree of presence, both of Chinese leaders and businesses throughout Africa and Latin America, and also very systematic efforts to bring Latin American, Caribbean, and African leaders regularly to China. I'm talking now about the positive side of this. There's an important negative side too. And China has also made tremendous use of educational diplomacy that we used to be involved in back in the Mansfield, Fulbright days. It has educated thousands of African financiers, engineers, and doctors, particularly, uses its universities very effectively that way. There are about 40,000 Kazakh undergraduates in Chinese universities, learning Chinese models of development, having mentors who they then work with when they return to Kazakhstan, such as their models for businesses, for hospitals and universities, are influenced by all of that. So there's been tremendous Chinese investment in all of these areas. It has a mixed record, a very mixed record, and a lot of the borrower countries have been saddled with debt and environmental destruction and unsupportable projects that they don't know how to work out. China keeps adjusting its BRI and other lending for these reasons, but they're undoubtedly providing real goods into some of these countries as well. They just built a major deep water port in Peru. And so the question is, where are we? China is also very involved in manipulating and influencing the media throughout Latin America and in Africa through Chinese propaganda. And again, we're not out there countering it. So China's record in the Global South is mixed, but their activism and their adjustment of policy and their investment is unrelenting. And so the question is generally, where are we? So yes, China is fairly well positioned, and they're also increasingly adept at using their lending relationships, their trading relationships throughout the Global South to get recipient countries to vote with them and with Russia at the United Nations. And we can say, well, this is bad, this is propaganda, this is media manipulation. All of those things are true, but it's also effective. Mm-hmm. And it can be harmful to our interests. So are we going to have the kind of investment and the kind of involvement that is needed to counter that. We can't just complain about bad China, bad China, bad China. We've got to put something on the barrelhead. So yes, I worry about this very much.
And Steve, welcome back, but I would just say you put another issue on the table that's going to be a big theme in the next several years. And that's as the tariffs went on China, they diverted through every place else. And if we're doing China plus one somewhere, we're there because you're not China. But if we find out you are China, that's going to be a challenge. And it's part of, I think, what's behind this UMCA wanting to reboot is that China investments in Mexico will be a key front points. Tuan, I think this is going to probably, because we have to close up here right at 11. Your last question? Go ahead and give us our last question. We have a mic here, so name and affiliation for the...
I'm Ton Nguyen, Boston Global Forum, and also work with Mark in this institute. I would like to get a comment about President Trump's strategy and investment in AI. Recently, I hear the 500 billion, and very important to compete with China. And the second, that is, I worry that Europe always talk about standard and democracy maintain value, but business depend on China very much. So how we can independent, how we can maintain value, democratic value with when we do business with China. And also the same with the US. Many companies in the US do with China and make China strong. And so now we are very dangerous and very difficult to compete with China. So what we can strategy to solve the issue?
Given we only have a couple of minutes left, I'm going to let you take that, Robert.
Clearly, AI is the area that so far, and again, very early days, and when we come out here and we see what news has happened in the past 90 minutes, maybe this will have been shifted somewhat, but he does seem to be early on interested in AI. He's talked about that in the past few days more than semiconductors. He just talked about this new SoftBank AI deal with Altman. It's not clear yet what that really means or what it includes. But clearly, we're going to be building more data centers. This is going to remain a focus my sense is that President Trump is also very committed to, winning this race. China, I can tell you, was shocked by the emergence of generative AI. They had thought that they were ahead of us in many ways, and they are in some, as Shihoko has alluded to. But now they're playing catch up on that side. I think this is a competition we're fully awake to, and it doesn't seem to be a partisan issue. On the question of AI and freedom in Europe, I'm less well versed in that and really not qualified to tackle that. I don't know if Shihoko, if this is something you look at or not. It's not something I'm qualified to speak on.
Well, let me just say we pride ourselves in closing on time, and I wish I had time for everybody else's questions because we'd really love here to stay and chat about them. But please give our panels a round of applause for their good conversation. Again, the Wilson Center appreciates you being here. Stay tuned to all of for more information. Thank you all very much. Thanks for being a great audience.